Welcome. I'm Elena Traster in the Environmental Studies Department here at MCLA, and we're so glad that you're joining us for another one of these Green Living seminars. The theme again this year is Rewilding Our World, and these presentations take place here in MCLA's Feigenbaum Center for Science and Innovation, Wednesdays at 5:30 p.m., room 121. They're all free and open to the public. And if you would like to check out the schedule of our upcoming presentations, you can take a look at our website, www.mcla.edu/greenliving. Before I introduce our presenter, I want to make a quick announcement and invite you to all come back again next week on Wednesday, March 12th. Andrew Madden, Western District Supervisor with the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, will present a lecture titled Land Conservation for Wildlife in Western Massachusetts. Today's presentation, Restoring Old Growth Characteristics to the Forest of New England, will be given by Paul Catanzaro. Paul's a professor in the Forest Ecology and Conservation program at the University of Massachusetts. He also serves as the Massachusetts State Extension Forester and co-directs the Family Forest Research Center, a partnership between UMass and the USDA Forest Service. Thanks so much for coming tonight, Paul.
Thanks for inviting me. Thank you for, thank you. Thanks for coming out. I know it's a rainy night. It's easy to throw another log on the fire and just kind of cozy up. So I appreciate your time coming out here tonight. The first thing I want to do is acknowledge my colleague, Tony D'Amato. Tony and I started this work actually when he was a PhD student at UMass. We had adjoining offices, and his dissertation work included or centered on defining where old growth is in Massachusetts, and then taking a look at how old growth forests are different than our current, what I'll call second growth forests. And through that process and our developing relationship and friendship, we developed this publication that I'm going to talk about tonight 20 years ago. And then the publication that I'm going to work off of tonight is actually an update of that. The reason we've updated it is because, and I'm going to let you in on a little secret, foresters for years have always been bummed out that no one recognized the importance of forests. And for years it felt like we were waving our arms, we were trying to get everyone to recognize the importance of forests, and boy, do people recognize the importance of forests now, with things like a biodiversity crash, with things like climate change, and the incredible, important, central, vital role that forests play. We careful what you wish for because you've got it. And that has caused a lot of conversation. Some of that has been emotional. Some of that emotional conversation has happened right here in Adams. It's my pleasure tonight to talk about this concept of restoring old growth characteristics. As I mentioned, we started this work about 20 years ago, and we sort of revived it because 20 years ago it was sort of this fun, interesting idea. And now it has come with much more relevancy, I guess you would say, based on things like climate change and biodiversity. So I'm going to talk about that today. It's a favorite subject, so I appreciate you coming out to hear about it tonight. Can't make decisions about where you're going to go in the future if you don't understand where you are now and how you got there. So let's just start way back when. People have been interacting with forests for thousands of years. And if you haven't been to this website, it's an excellent website. It shows homeland territories of indigenous people all across the country. And it would be, it's a wonderful visit, so check it out. People have been interacting with forests for thousands of years. There is much debate as to how much they interacted with the forest, and there's ongoing debate about how big the population of indigenous people was in our region throughout the years. But the one thing that people can generally agree on is that the interactions of indigenous people and our forests were not so intensive, for the most part, that forests and natural disturbances and processes weren't still the main drivers, okay? So for thousands of years, forests grew and developed over time, and though there was human interaction, for the most part, it was the forest growing and developing that really changed through time. This is where we hit that significant point in time in our region where human and forest interaction had a really profound effect that we are still recovering from today. So I'm going to give you 200 years or at least 100 years of history in about three slides or three pictures. If you're not familiar with these are the dioramas from Harvard Forest Fisher Museum. They're world-renowned for showing past land use history here in New England. And up in the upper left-hand corner, they show what sort of pre-colonial forest would have looked like. We're going to talk about that. We're going to break that down into specific characteristics, so I'll leave that for a moment. By the mid-1700s, settlement was such that most people really focused on subsistence farming. So people cleared the forests to build a homestead to primarily grow food for themselves and their family. That changed in the mid-1800s when subsistence farming really developed into market farming. So people were growing things and selling them to markets in more populated centers. As you can see from the dioramas, and these are the same farm through time, you can see in the dioramas, this period in the mid-1800s was, and I'll show a graph of this in a minute, was really the low point of forest cover in this region. And it happened a little bit differently in different places, but generally speaking, it was in the mid-1800s that we hit this low point of forest cover, all right? I want you to remember this picture. This is the reset button. Do you see a lot of dead wood on the ground? No. Any understory plants? Any leaf litter? No. This is sort of time zero, right? This is reset. And then with farm abandonment, people discovered that you could actually farm in the Ohio River Valley and not just farm rocks. You can actually go and farm crops and things. There was a sort of an exodus from the New England farms 2 points further west. And so we had this farm abandonment period. Pine is a species that, because of its own silvics, grows really well or is competitive in terms of revegetating pasture areas, which most of the landscape would have been. So we had this really robust return of pine that we would not normally have seen had it not been for this human land use clearing. And there was the second wholesale clearing of pine in our region, primarily for box boards to crate goods up that were moving out west. So we not only had one wholesale clearing in our landscapes, we've had two wholesale clearings in our landscapes through time. This is work that was done by Mark Ducey up in New Hampshire, taking a look at what's known as the Forest Inventory and Analysis, or FIA plots. These are plots the U.S. Forest Service does all across the country to literally count trees. How are we doing? How many trees do we have? Are they healthy or are they not? How many are dying? How big are they? So these are FIA plots that Ducey et al. Took a look at. If you look at the date, it's 2013, so we're about 10 or 12 years. If you sort of skew that graph a little bit to the right in your mind's eye, you'll see that much of our forest is about 100 years old, right? And that jives with what we know about our past land use history with that clearing of pine. So much of our forests are about 100 years old. That sounds old to us. I know it sounds old to me in human time, but the reality is in ecological time, that's still pretty darn young, right? We're still sort of like, forests are still sort of teenagers at this point. We're going to talk about that change over time. So we've got this reset button that happened not just one or two places discretely. We had this reset button that happened all across the eastern U.S. It sort of started as a wave in New England and moved across, to the Midwest. And this has really had profound effects on our forest as I said, that we're still recovering from today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about terminology, because I find that when people have conversations about forests, and old growth in particular, lots of terms get thrown out. And there's really hot debate right now happening at the federal level in terms of what the definition of mature is. I've heard ancient forests, primary forests, climax. There's lots of different words that are used to describe. And in our publication, we've defined 3 different terms that I want to just clarify for you today that I'm going to use today moving forward with the presentation, but frankly, others have adopted. So what is old growth? Old growth are forests that have never been directly impacted by that intensive colonial land use. That's it. That's old growth. So if it got through that wave of logging and clearing for agriculture, it's old growth, okay? And oftentimes, the only things that got through those 2 sieves were hard to reach in areas you wouldn't want to get to anyway. We'll look at that in a minute. So that's what old growth forest is. Second growth forest is what we've got back, okay? And we've had a tremendous rebound in our forests. In fact, I would say to you, it's not an exaggeration to say that the recovery of our forests in New England and in this region is one of the great environmental comeback stories in history. It is, you know, we had, as you saw from the slides, cleared the twice, and our forests robustly have come back. We have relatively young soils, you know, only 10 or 12,000 years, but that's relatively young in soil time, which means they're nutrient rich. We've got a great climate. We get ample precipitation. Our landscapes want to grow forests. That's a good thing, and they did. And what we have back is what we term second growth. So it's not old growth, it's what came back. It's the second growth. Here's the new term. Here's the difference between our original publications and this recent publication. Old forest. At some point, when these second growth forests keep growing, keep aging, and keep developing over time, what happens, right? Do they become old growth? And when we first started this work 20 years ago, boy, did we really catch heck. We had to really make sure people knew we weren't saying you could recreate old growth forests. We had to be very clear about that. We were not saying that. But as the 20 years have gone on, people have said, well, if it's not old growth, what the heck is it then? So old forests, okay? And the way we know that a forest has moved from second growth forest to old forest is by taking a look at the characteristics of the forest and whether they've accrued a critical mass of those characteristics that would put them in the same ballpark as old growth. Does that make sense? Okay. No one really knows if our forests continue to age and grow and develop, if they will truly be old growth forests. There are relationships in a forest that, frankly, humbly, we don't know. And so we don't know if all those will be restored. I think for now it's safe to say, let's call them old forests. Let's measure them, not by age, because different sites and different forests develop differently. Let's measure them by those characteristics like complexity, deadwood, and so forth, okay? So those are the 3 terms I'm going to move forward with today. Does that make sense? Okay, great. So what was the past extent of old growth? When you take a look, and this is, you know, generally all agreed upon information, I would say. Old growth forests covered about 90% of Massachusetts, all right? So this was the dominant, by far, right? By the vast majority, this was the dominant land use, land cover for thousands of years. This is the condition our species evolved with. Mostly old growth forests with probably somewhere like 5 to 10% in what we would call today early successional or shrubby habitats from various disturbances that moved around the landscape, giving it a sort of a mosaic, all right? But about 90%. So that graph up there from Harvard Forest also graphs, so forest cover are in the colors by state. You can see the same trend with each New England state. and then that green shaded area is population. So you can see we went from pre-colonial 90% reset button, remember, back to what we have today, second growth, 100 years old, ecologically still young. So what do we have today? So I talked at a conference, an old growth conference about a year or so ago, and I called a bunch of people. I was looking online. I was trying to find studies and things like what book has this information? And no one had it. So I just called colleagues in each state, and I was like, hey, what do you got over there in Vermont? Hey, what do you got up there in New Hampshire? And I just sort of put the table together. But I hope you can see the trend. There is not a lot of old growth forest in Massachusetts and in New England. And in fact, there's our Massachusetts number. And in fact, the Maine number, which is the largest, includes old forests. They sort of cluster all of that with their old growth. So it sort of amplifies it, but I hope you can get the sense. There is not a lot of old growth forest in New England, in Massachusetts. In fact, I would say it's probably the rarest habitat that we have. So this is where I spend my time. I love old growth. Old growth forest, my colleague Tony is fond of saying, being someone that studies and thinks about old growth forests is being like a wildlife biologist that gets to study pandas, right? Everybody loves pandas. You know, you're the lucky ones that gets to study pandas. Like, I feel like we're the lucky ones that we get to think about, study old growth. I love it. It's fantastic, right? It's warm and fuzzy and it's all of those things. But the reality is, what do we do with the other 99+% of the landscape, right? That was historically old growth, that our species would have evolved with. Like what do? We absolutely, legislatively need to protect our old growth forests. We got to understand them. We should buffer them. We should do every measure. But then what do we do with the other part of the landscape that's really driving the benefits that we see of our forests? And that's where, we spend our time. So to answer that question, let's break down what old growth forests are. Okay, let's break down some of the characteristics that make up old growth forests. And to do that, I've included a graphic that I really like from the textbook I use in my forest management class. This is Jerry Franklin and Norm Johnson's textbook, Ecological Forest Management. This just shows a profile of forest succession, generally speaking. So on the far left, this is a time in history where there was a very large disturbance. Okay, let's call it a wind disturbance, since that's the most common disturbance in our region. So there was this really dramatic hurricane, okay, knocked down a lot of trees, killed a lot of trees. We start at time zero. The forest starts growing back, gets bigger, gets older, and so forth. Yeah, makes sense? Importantly, even the largest scale disturbances that we see don't kill everything, right? You may have heard the term stand replacing disturbance. We really don't, stand replacing disturbance, even the 1938 hurricane, even that big tornado that came through Brimfield 10 years ago or so, when we see these large scale disturbances come through, things survive. Trees survive standing, right? Not all the trees go. Sometimes there's a skip pattern as the hurricane goes up the hill. Maybe they're sort of tucked in there in a little cove in the landscape. Maybe they weren't big trees. Maybe they were saplings, and the wind, was sort of able, it was resilient, pliant enough to just sort of swing back and forth. What about the soil? Soil's still there. What about all the seeds in the soil? What about the sprouts? What about the roots? All of those are what we talk about, term biological legacies. Right? Those are things that exist on the site after a big disturbance. So even after a big disturbance here, there's some trees standing, right? These are our biological legacies. There's some little seedlings in here. The wind didn't bother them at all. Okay? There's some seeds in the seed bank. There's even dead wood. Right? Those are all biological legacies. Those biological legacies extend into the next phase of the forest, right? It provides continuity. Little bit of that old forest is still there. and it still exists in what the new forest has become. Does that make sense? That's a profoundly important idea to this concept. All right, so we've got continuity. That's how forests grow and evolve. When you take a look at regeneration rates on forests that have a lot of dead wood in them, you'll see that there's a lot more regeneration, particularly things like birch and hemlock that have evolved over time to regenerate on those substrates. Our forests have evolved with these biological legacies over thousands of years. So they know how to respond to that, and it's these biological legacies that not only maintain the character and some of the benefits of that original forest, but they're also the attributes that help it regenerate. Okay? So what is a snag here is a down log here. What's a young tree here is an old tree there. All right? And what's a little tree here is a big tree there. Where that end point is, I don't know. I had a friend, colleague, who was doing some coring. So to age a tree, you core it and you count the rings. He was doing that in some old growth areas in the Northeast. He cored, I think it was a black birch. Is it a black birch at over 200 years old? I never knew a black birch could grow that old. I don't think we have a concept of how old trees and forests can be, right? 1830s reset. Right? These are only 100 years old. There's no end point to that. It just keeps going if you let it. Okay? So with that, let's talk about the characteristics of old growth forests based on, okay, what we see, the forces that have shaped them through time. So diversity of tree sizes and age. When you say old growth forest, the first thing that comes to mind is big trees. Amen, brother. And I love them, man. It's great, right? You go, you look at it, and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it's that big. Now, we don't have sequoias and redwoods and things, but we still grow some pretty big trees. That's right. That's sort of like, right, if it's like studying pandas, that's the post, right? The big tree is the postcard. But what I'm going to talk about through this whole presentation is what creates the characteristics in old growth forest is disturbance, right? It's change over time, which means that we not only have big trees, but we have a diversity of tree sizes and ages. We have big trees, we have medium trees, we have little trees, all of which started because of this. This is a stem map, stem density map. The darker the color, the higher the concentration of bigger and older trees. The lighter the color, the lower the concentration. Okay? What you see here, and this is a stem map of an old growth forest, is you see this patchiness, this gappiness. The wind came through, the hurricane came through, insects came through, ice came through, whatever it was, some combination of all of those, and it created patchiness across the forest, right? That gives big old trees, that gives small young trees, that gives everything in between. Yes? Vertical differential. You ready for this? Flip it on its side. Horizontal heterogeneity. So we have some areas, those young trees when they grow, they compete. You've been through, a young thicket and all those stems are in there. The stems are really close together. And the big trees, they're spread apart, right? Because only a handful of them were able to survive. And then you got areas in between. So we have both vertical diversity and horizontal heterogeneity. You can see that here. So this is some work colleague John Hagan's doing up in Maine. This is a LiDAR map, for those of you not familiar with it. The brighter the color, the taller the tree. So you see kind of a handful of some red trees. Those are the real tall ones. The orange and yellow can make up the main canopy. The green and blues are the younger, smaller, lower ones, shorter ones. That's water, so you can ignore that. What you see here, I hope, is what we see here, right? It's that gappiness. It's that patchiness. Wind came through and it knocked down some trees, left the other part of the forest standing. That young, that part that was knocked down initiated a new cohort, and now you've got some age and size differential. This is classic old growth, okay? Old trees. Old growth forests have old trees, right? Duh. But old trees are different, all right? I'll give you a couple examples. Red oak, right? Can't trip in the forest in Massachusetts without hitting a red oak. When I look for a red oak, this is typically what I look for, right? You got the flat silver, I think of them almost as ski slopes coming down. You get those red fissures in between, right? When they're young, they got this smooth bark until they sort of mature into this. Guess what? It keeps going. That's primary bark, secondary bark, tertiary bark. Not a lot of people see this, right? Reset button, 1830s, right? We're not to that point yet. But when you get it to that point, it's different. And so I put this on here because in my eye, I don't know if you can follow my red, that's sort of the bark sloughing off and this tertiary bark developing and still some of that secondary bark. That bark is rough, and it's got lots of little nooks and crannies in there, and it holds a lot of great protein-rich native insects, right? It's a really niche-rich environment, and if you're a bird that likes to, eat off the bowl, that's really important to native habitat. Old trees are different. This is my favorite tree in Massachusetts, by the way. I love this tree. But these old trees show different characteristics. They show their age, just like us. When I was young, I would look at a guy my age, and I would think to myself, how the heck did that guy look so tired? Like, what the heck happened to that guy? Now I'm that age, and I'm like, oh, yeah, that's what happened. Same thing with forests, right? Things happen through time. The reason that this crown is so different, to me it looks like sort of this giant bonsai tree, is because it has been subjected to windstorms and ice storms over centuries, right? Part of the crown cracked off in an ice storm, and other branches and laterals took over. And so you get this really interesting crown morphology that is really interesting habitat for things like raptors and things. You get rot. Rot's wonderful. Dead's great. We're going to talk about that almost for the rest of the time. This is really important habitat, and this doesn't happen in 10 years. This doesn't even happen necessarily in 100 years. This takes a long time to develop. But the value of this is profound. We want this benefit, and we want to carry that through the next phase of the forest, right? This takes hundreds of years. Does anybody know what those are? The bear's claws. Very good. You're becoming a star student, sir. These are bear's claws, and I don't know if you can tell, there's some lighter brown ones here. Should have saved this for Andrew Madden. He would have done this better. But those are different years worth of bears climbing up the tree. This is obviously an important part of that forest, right? It's providing food source, providing habitat. This takes a long time, decades and maybe centuries to develop in a forest. We don't want to lose that. Old trees are unique. Dead wood, hugely important characteristic of old growth forests. And this is a part of Tony's work. He documented that old growth forests in Massachusetts have about 2 to 3 times more what we call snags, or standing dead wood, right? And not only do we have snags and standing dead wood, we have them in different phases of decay. So we've got them, right? This just happened pretty recently. The bark's still on it, it's still sound wood. We've got some heart rot, as is evidenced by the shelf fungus. And at this point, the bark has sloughed off. Insects have invaded it. Woodpeckers have excavated it. It's wonderful habitat. And in the next big windstorm, that's probably going to go over and be a dead log. We have this conveyor belt, I guess, if you will, or these different stages of cavities, because we get a regular pulse, right, of disturbances that creates them through time. That's a very important point. Same thing with down logs. We have, in fact, it was even more. It was 2 to 4 times more dead wood on the ground in old growth forests than in our secondary forest. That came out of his dissertation work. All of you have stacked a cord of wood, I hope. If not, that's your homework. Go and stack a cord of wood. so you can get a sense of what 15 cords per acre looks like and feels like. That's a lot of wood. Similarly, we get this conveyor belt, right? This is a top that just snapped off. By the time you get down here, you might walk on and say, what the heck, what was that? You know, it was mushy and all kinds of things. These are really important components of the forest for wildlife, okay, both standing and then a whole suite of species that use it when it's on the forest floor. These are also, the more we learn, the more we recognize the importance of carbon storage in dead wood as a component of forests. So these are really important. Also, some hydrological functionality to these logs, right? They retain water within the system, which is why those smart hemlocks and birch like to seed on those. It's why those amphibians like to crawl under there. Really important part of the forest. Late successional plant communities. Lena, I should let you talk about this. This is another characteristic of old growth forests. A lot of these plant species move across the landscape and are moved around in very slow fashion, sort of like ant-dispersed seeds, right? Ant-dispersed seeds ain't going 50 miles anytime soon. It sort of slowly radiates out, right, as the ants move the seeds, as the plants are able to establish themselves and grow. So we see different, late successional plant communities. Did you see any of this in the pastures in 1830? It takes a long time to come back to the landscape and sort of spread through the forest. So those are the characteristics of an old growth forest. Recognize that they are continuous disturbance over centuries that actually create those kinds of characteristics within our forest, all right? I used to put this at the end of my presentation, right? Every time, in fact, our original publication had this quote, and actually that's the cover from the original publication, because it was so obvious that this is what we were talking about. And then it occurred to me, Paul, you dummy, that shouldn't go at the end, that should go in the middle, right? That's the transition between the characteristics and trying to keep all of those cogs and wheels. I will also say this. We expect an awful lot from our forests, right? We want water, we want wood products, we want wonderful biodiversity. Over the last 10 or 20 years, we want carbon and mitigation, climate change mitigation. Who knows what we're going to want in another 20 years? We expect a lot from our forests. How much are we giving back? Like, what's that relationship look like? And what are we doing to reciprocate? And every time I talk about this and read, Robin Wall Kimmerer's work, this just sort of stands out to me. So to me, this is a part, and then I'll get off of it, get back to the science stuff. But to me, this is a part of our evolving relationship with forests that needs to change. That's a cultural shift. All right, so we got 99% of the landscape of the forest that isn't in this old growth condition. Like, how do we get there? Well, there are two pathways that I'm going to talk about tonight. One is a passive management, right? We can take a hands-off approach, maybe, hold that thought. Theoretically, we could take a passive management approach into these systems that are functionally normal, regenerating normally, and just sit back and let nature do its thing. Let disturbance be the driver of the forest in terms of its change. Let growth, development, competition be those internal mechanisms that create the structural attributes and sort of get us to old forest. So that's one way we can do that, absolutely, and it's an important way. So windstorms, ice storms, insects, these are our friends in the development of forests. And forests have evolved with our native insects to move around and regenerate around these things. That means that if you're interested in that approach, that I would encourage you to not salvage, right? I know this looks messy, but these are the very mechanisms that create the structural attributes we're looking for. If you are going to salvage, suggest you, and certainly there are times, right? It's around the trail, it's near, I don't know, there's human health issues or human safety issues that you have to salvage. I get that. But to the extent you can maintain that condition in the forest, or even areas of that condition, very helpful in terms of creating those old growth characteristics, okay? I'm going to tell it. All right, so there was actually a mutual friend of ours, worked hard to establish some forest management on a conservation land not far from here. And he had worked with his organization over the course of years and years to let him do this. And he did this just tremendous job, this small-scale forest management, timber harvest. And he was really excited by it. And so he invited me out, and we took a walk together, and we took a look at this forest management they had done. And it looked beautiful. I mean, it was just spotless. It was, it was clean, and it was well-spaced. And he just did a tremendous job with it. And we're walking down the trail, and that was on the left. And on the right, a windstorm had come through, and it had just jackstrawed everything over there. And it was just this really funny moment of, we like Disneyland. We like everything clear and clean and orderly, right? That's good to us. And over here is the way nature likes it. Given where we are right now, at about 100 years old or so,